The Cloak dropped on a human battleship, and the entire galactic throne knew it. Was too late. The alert did not come with a warning tone. It came as silence. 1 second, the bridge of the relentless defiance was humming with the quiet sounds of 11 weeks of patient, hidden work. The next second, Captain Alara Mwangi was standing at the center console with a data pad in her hand, and every person on the bridge could tell from the way she was holding it that something had changed. Not a small change, the kind of change that bends the direction of an entire era. She read the message once to herself. Then she read it aloud. I was standing at the navigation station when she spoke. My name is Mara Voss. I am the executive officer of the Relentless Defiance, which means I am the second most responsible person on this ship and the first person the captain looks at when she needs someone to understand the situation without explanation. I had been in deep space with this crew for 11 weeks. I had eaten bad rations with them, slept in short rotations with them, and watched them run silent drills in the dark without complaint. When Captain Mwangi finished reading, I understood the message completely. The Galactic Conclave, the coalition of 15 alien species that had governed interstellar politics for 2 centuries, had voted to reclassify humanity as a controlled species. The vote had passed 12-3. 3 dissenting species had been quietly pressured into changing their votes before the final count was taken. The measure was already filed, signed, and recorded in the Conclave archives as law. What that meant in plain terms was this: humanity would no longer have independent fleet authority. Our warships would require Conclave approval to move. Our military decisions would be reviewed by an oversight body we had no seat on. Our right to defend ourselves on our own terms would belong to someone else. 30 years ago, when Earth joined the Conclave as a protectorate member, the agreement had included 6 specific protections. Those protections had been written into the founding charter. They had been signed by every member species. They were not suggestions. They were binding law. The Conclave had just ignored every one of them. Nobody on the bridge spoke. I looked at Lieutenant Ben Calloway at the communication station. He was 24 years old, the youngest officer on the bridge, and he was looking at the data pad like a man who has just realized that the building he was standing in does not have a fire exit. I looked at Chief Operations Officer Diane Hollies, who had 17 years of service and who I had personally never seen rattle. She was rubbing her thumb across the back of her left hand, which was the only habit she had that she could not control when something hit her hard. Captain Mwangi set the data pad down on the console. She looked at me. I said, "Weapons are green across the board, Captain." She nodded once. "I know," she said. "I checked before I read it out." That was Alara Mwangi. She had been a fleet captain for 9 years. She had commanded 3 different ships and had never once raised her voice on a bridge. In a crisis, she did not need to. When you have thought 2 steps further ahead than every other person in the room, raising your voice is unnecessary. She walked to her command chair and sat down. "Get me a secure channel to the other 7, she said. Calloway's hands were already moving. The other 7 were the human warships, positioned throughout this sector of the Kareth corridor. each one running under a cloaking field identical to ours, each one waiting. We had not been gathered here by accident. 11 weeks ago, Fleet Command on Earth had quietly moved 8 warships into the corridor under total communication silence, no public record, no conclave notification, no announcement of any kind. From the outside, it looked like routine patrol redistribution. It was not routine, it had been planned for over a year, constructed around a single question that fleet intelligence had been quietly modeling since the conclave began shifting its internal politics 3 years prior. The question was simple: if the conclave ever moved against Earth's sovereign fleet rights, what would the response look like? Not what should it look like. What would actually work? The answer that came back from every model, every simulation, every strategic projection was the same. Do not negotiate from weakness. Do not ask for a seat at a table that has already voted against you. Show up where you were not expected in a form no one planned for, and let the mathematics of the situation speak for themselves. Over the secure channel, the other 7 captains joined the link one by one. I listened as Mwangi briefed them. She was brief. She read the conclave order. She stated the facts. She then said that the relentless defiance would be dropping its cloak at 600 hours station time, and asked if there were any objections. There were none. Captain Leon Ford of the carrier Harrow Point said, "We've been ready for 8 days." Captain Nina George of the frigate Crossfield said nothing at all, which from her meant the same thing. The others checked in with affirmative, so calm and flat that an outside observer might have thought they were confirming a supply transfer. The channel closed. I spent the next several hours walking the ship, not because I was required to, but because I wanted to see the crew. Before the morning came, I walked through the engineering bays, where Lieutenant Greg Baines and his team were running their 4th full systems check of the day, methodical and quiet, moving from panel to panel with the focused efficiency of people who had done this so many times that their hands worked without waiting for their minds. I walked through the crew quarters level, where off-rotation personnel were doing what sailors have always done before the serious moments arrive. Some were reading, some were writing messages home that would not be sent for another 12 hours. One man named Private Oliver Shaw was teaching a card game to 2 Marines who had clearly already learned it, judging by the pile of ration chips in front of them, but who were letting him teach it anyway because it gave all 3 of them something to do with their hands. I did not give a speech. Nobody wanted a speech. What people want in the hours before something real happens is the quiet confirmation that the people responsible for the situation are not afraid of it. So I walked and I nodded, and I answered the few questions that were asked of me with steady, short answers, and I let the crew see that the executive officer of this ship was not packing the corridors in panic. I went back to the bridge at 5:00 in the morning and sat down at my station. I thought about the conclave. I thought about the 16 years I had spent working alongside their officers in joint operations, the way they looked at human ships with something between curiosity and mild contempt, the way their diplomatic staff spoke about humanity in official sessions, as though we were a project they were managing, rather than a species they had signed a treaty with. I thought about the word protectorate, They had always meant it as a kindness. We had always known it was a leash. At 5:59, Captain Mwangi walked onto the bridge and took her chair without a word. The bridge crew was fully staffed. Every station was occupied, every system was live. The only thing missing was visibility. To every sensor in the Kareth corridor, the relentless defiance did not exist. In 60 seconds, that was going to change. I watched the clock. At 600 hours exactly, Captain Mwangi said one word. Now. And the cloak came down. The first thing I noticed was not a sound or an alarm, it was the silence from the conclave sensor net, which lasted exactly 4 seconds before it erupted. 4 seconds is how long it takes a passive sensor array to confirm that what it is reading is real and not a malfunction. I know this because we had studied every piece of publicly available conclave sensor documentation for 2 years before. This morning, 4 seconds of disbelief, then confirmation, then the cascade of responses that follow when a system that was designed to detect threats detects one it was not built to expect. Across a front of nearly 2 million kilometers, 8 human warships appeared on sensors simultaneously. Not clustered, not grouped for mutual defense, spread wide, positioned in a formation that no conclave tactical model had ever categorized because it had not been designed as a combat formation. It had been designed by human engineers in the early days of asteroid mining operations to coordinate large fleets across enormous distances with minimal communication overhead. Humans called it the anvil. Every ship in the formation could act independently, communicate through a relay chain, and cover an enormous stretch of space without a single vessel being isolated. We had adapted it for exactly this moment. I watched Callaway's display as the conclave military frequencies filled with traffic. The translation software could not keep up. Messages were being sent, recalled, resent, and overridden at a rate the system flagged as statistically abnormal. I could read fragments as they scrolled. Most of them were questions. Where did they come from? How many? Confirm the count. Confirm again. The phrase that appeared most frequently was a Varenti military idiom. The closest English translation is something like, this outcome was not in the model. I appreciated that. We are being hailed, Callaway said. His voice was completely steady. I was proud of him. Put it through, Captain Mwangi said. The face that appeared on the main display was Admiral Sorvath of the Conclave First Armada. He was Varenti, which many had the characteristic gray-blue complexion and the large amber eyes that gave Varenti faces their unsettling stillness. He was in full uniform. His expression was composed in the specific way that experienced commanders compose themselves when they are processing something they did not plan for, while simultaneously projecting that they planned for everything. He was good at it. Most conclave admirals were. He told us we were in violation of 17 statutes of the Galactic Conclave Charter, and that our vessels should stand down immediately and submit to conclave authority pending review. There was a pause after he finished. Real pause, not a dramatic one, the kind that happens when the person on the other side of a conversation is choosing their words with care because the words are going to matter. Captain Mwangi leaned forward slightly in her chair. She spoke for approximately 45 seconds. She did not raise her voice. She did not use dramatic language. She read from memory 6 clauses of the original Protectorate Agreement that Earth had signed with the Conclave 30 years ago. Specifically, the 6 clauses that guaranteed Earth's independent fleet sovereignty, the 6 clauses that prohibited the Conclave from restricting human military authority without unanimous council approval, and the 6 clauses that the Conclave's reclassification vote had directly contradicted. She reached the 4th clause and stopped. Sorvath's composure did not break. It shifted. There is a difference. The muscles around his jaw moved in a way that Varenthi faces do when a thought arrives that the owner of the face had not invited. It was small. If you had not spent 2 years studying Varenthi body language from recorded diplomatic footage, you would have missed it entirely. I had spent 2 years studying it. I made a note in my log. What Sorvath did not know and what the Conclave High Command would not discover until approximately 11 minutes after this conversation ended was that the relentless defiance had been broadcasting on an open civilian subspace frequency since the moment our cloak came down. Not the military channels, not the diplomatic networks. The open civilian frequency that was used by commercial shipping, independent news services, and private citizens across 43 inhabited star systems. 43 systems were watching this conversation in real time. Sorvath composed himself and said that, regardless of the legality of the reclassification measure, an armed confrontation was not an appropriate response and that the human fleet should withdraw. Captain Mwangi said politely that we were within the boundaries of a sector designated as shared navigation space in the 3rd Conclave Transit Agreement, and that we had every right to be exactly where we were. Sorvath said something in Varenthi that the translation software rendered as, "This is not going to end well for you." Captain Mwangi said, "We'll see." The channel closed. I turned to Calloway and asked about the civilian broadcast. He checked his panel, 43 systems, he confirmed, a Varenthi civilian news channel picked it up 30 seconds in. They are currently titling their live feed. He read from his screen without expression. The humans have lost their minds. I looked at him. I suppose that's one interpretation, I said. Their viewership has tripled in the last 8 minutes, he added. I allowed myself a small moment of satisfaction and then returned to my station. The Conclave's 2nd Armada entered sensor range 40 minutes later. 31 ships moving in a broad tactical sweep positioned exactly as our intelligence projections had predicted. Their doctrine was straightforward. When a smaller force refuses to comply, you bring a force large enough to make compliance mathematically obvious. 3-1 is considered the threshold for overwhelming advantage in Conclave military theory. 31 ships to our 8 was almost 4-1. From their perspective, this was an argument that ended itself. From our perspective, it was exactly what we had built for. I want to be clear about what the relentless defiance was. She was not a beautiful ship if you looked at her from the outside, which I had done many times from service shuttle. She looked like someone had welded several large gray boxes together and then attached weapons to every flat surface. No curves, no elegance, the Conclave built warships the way artists build. Sculptures with attention to proportion and line and the kind of aesthetic intention that makes something look like it belongs in space. We built ours the way engineers build. Tools with attention to function, reliability, and the stubborn insistence that every system work correctly under conditions that would destroy the system on any other ship. She had been refitted twice in the last 6 years. Every piece of technology we could not build, maintain, or repair ourselves had been stripped out and replaced with something we could. Her mass drivers were built in a factory in Sheffield. Her missile clusters were assembled and tested in a facility outside Cape Town. Her electronic warfare suite had been designed by a team of 12 engineers in Bristol, running on software that the same team had written, tested, and could fix with tools available on the ship. We could not match the Conclave ship for ship. We had never tried to. What we could do was understand our own systems completely, respond to damage faster than any opponent expected, and keep fighting long after the point. The tactical calculus said we should have stopped. When the Second Armada moved into engagement range, our 8 ships did not group together, they spread further apart, each one taking its assigned harassment vector, each one doing the thing they had been positioned and prepared to do. We were not trying to win this engagement, we were trying to make it expensive. We were trying to demonstrate in the clearest terms available that removing us from this sector would cost more than the Conclave was willing to spend. The Relentless took her first hit. A Conclave energy lance struck the port forward section and took out a secondary power junction. The ship shuddered. Lights on the bridge dropped to emergency level for about 3 seconds. Then came back. From engineering, Lieutenant Greg Baines' voice came over the internal channel. Port forward junction is out. I have a team on it. I said, how long? He said 12 minutes. It took 9. I do not know exactly what Baines and his team did in those 9 minutes because I was watching the tactical display and managing 3 simultaneous contact situations, but I know that when the power junction came back online, the Conclave tactical systems flagged the recovery speed as a probable sensor error. Their own doctrine said that level of battle damage required a minimum of 30 minutes to address. Their computers, faced with a 9-minute repair, assumed something had gone wrong with the data. Nothing had gone wrong with the data. Baines and his team were simply very good at their jobs, and they had practiced this specific repair under simulated combat conditions 47 times in the past year. Practice is not a glamorous concept. It does not make for interesting stories at social gatherings, but it is the difference between a crew that functions in a crisis and a crew that does not. And we had practiced until every damage scenario was as familiar as the layout of the ship itself. The second hit came 20 minutes later and took out a section of our communications relay. Calloway rerouted through a backup channel without being asked and had us back on full comms in under 4 minutes. He was 19 months out of the academy. He had never been in a live engagement before this morning. You would not have known it from watching him work. At this point, approximately 90 minutes into the engagement, something happened that I had been waiting for since the Cloak came down. A Conclave fleet intelligence alert went out on one of their secure channels. We knew it was a fleet intelligence alert because we had spent 11 weeks quietly recording and cataloging every conclave signal format used in this sector, and we had learned to recognize the header structure of their classification system. The alert was brief. It said that an analysis of human electronic warfare activity during the current engagement had revealed evidence of extensive prior intelligence collection on conclave, fleet communications, encryption, protocols, and subspace relay infrastructure. In other words, they had just figured out that we had been watching them for 11 weeks. I looked at Captain Mwenji. She was looking at the tactical display with the focus calm she always had during active situations. They know, I said. Yes, she said. How do you feel about that? She considered for a moment. I think it confirms what we wanted them to understand, she said. We didn't just show up, we prepared. Those are two very different things. She was right. Showing up with 8 ships and no preparation is a statement of desperation. Showing up with 8 ships after 11 weeks of hidden observation, after cataloging their communications and mapping their fleet movements and quietly memorizing the response patterns of their tactical systems, is a different statement entirely. It says that the people across from you planned this, studied for it, and arrived knowing more about you than you know about yourself. Sorveth ordered a full communications blackout on all conclave channels 47 seconds after the intelligence alert. It did not matter. We already had everything we needed. And somewhere in the civilian broadcast that was still running, a political commentator on a Varenthi news channel was now asking aloud, with genuine curiosity, why, if humanity was so manageable, this engagement was already approaching its 3rd hour with no resolution in sight. I thought that was a very good question. The 3rd hour passed the 4th hour. Ships continued their assigned harassment vectors. Conclave vessels pursued. No human ship was destroyed. 2 of ours had taken serious system damage. None of them withdrew. One of the things that alien species consistently misunderstand about human beings is the relationship between stubbornness and strategy. From the outside, when a human force refuses to retreat under overwhelming odds, it looks like irrationality. It looks like pride overriding survival instinct. What it actually is in most cases is a calculation that looks different from the one the opponent is running. The conclave's calculation was based on the assumption that the cost of this engagement to humanity was the status of 8 warships and the personal safety of their crews. Under that model, continuing to fight made no sense once the mathematical outcome was clear. Our calculation included something their model did not: the cost to the conclave, not just in ships or resources, but in the political capital they were spending in front of 43 watching star systems. Every single hour they failed to end an engagement against a force less than a quarter their size. Every hour this continued was a public relations catastrophe for the conclave. Every hour made the watching species ask harder questions. Every hour increased the gap between the image the conclave had built of itself as the natural, necessary, unchallengeable authority of galactic civilization and the reality of what was happening in this sector right now. We were not trying to defeat their armada, we were trying to make the Armada too expensive to keep deploying. There is a difference. At hour 6 the first crack appeared. It came from an unexpected direction, though perhaps it should not have been unexpected at all. The Cathar Laure, one of the 3 species that had originally voted against the reclassification measure, issued a formal public statement calling for an immediate ceasefire and the opening of negotiation talks. Humanity had cultivated a quiet trade relationship with the Cathar Laure for 20 years, not dramatic cooperation, not high-profile alliance building, just steady, reliable commercial exchange, respectful diplomatic communication, and the kind of slow, patient relationship building that produces goodwill, precisely because it asks for nothing in return. The Cathalora statement was not pro-human, it was pro-stability. It said that the current engagement was damaging to conclave unity and called for dialogue, but the effect was the same. For the first time in over a century, a conclave member species had publicly broken from the Armada's position during an active operation. 3 more species filed formal abstention notices within the following 2 hours. They did not support humanity. They did not condemn the conclave. They simply and formally declined to endorse what was happening in the Kareth corridor. I was watching the political feed alongside the tactical display, tracking both at the same time. Captain Mwangi had approved this dual monitoring setup at the beginning of the engagement, because we had always known that the outcome of this situation would be decided in political space, not in physical space. The ships were the argument, the conclave council chambers were where the argument would be settled. Sorvath facing the drift in his coalition and the unanswered questions building in the civilian broadcast, made a decision. He targeted the relay stations carrying the civilian broadcast signal in rapid succession. 2 commercial relay stations in the sector were destroyed by conclave fire. The civilian feed went dark. On our bridge, there was a moment of silence. Then Calloway said, "The Voroneth Free Press has picked up the last 40 minutes of recording from its own archive and is rebroadcasting it with full commentary." I knew the Voroneth Free Press. Most people in the galaxy did. The Voroneth had a complicated relationship with the conclave that went back 90 years and involved a territorial dispute that had never been formally resolved, and a press tradition that treated editorial independence as a founding cultural value. They did not like the conclave. They had never particularly tried to hide that. What Soravath had done by destroying those relay stations was hand the Voroneth Free Press the best story they had been given in a decade, an active military operation to suppress civilian information coverage. Journalists had been killed by the destruction of the relay stations, 2 of them non-human journalists working for commercial news services who had been transmitting from a legally registered civilian installation. The story was no longer about 8 human warships in the Kareth corridor. The story was about the conclave destroying a civilian press installation to prevent coverage of its own military action. 7 more species filed formal protest within the next 3 hours, not abstentions, protests. Soravath had made a mistake, not a small one, and we had not planned it or caused it. He had simply done the thing that powerful institutions do when they feel cornered and frustrated and cannot afford to acknowledge that the situation is not going their way. He had reached for more force, and that reach had cost him more than anything we had done. On the bridge of the relentless defiance, we were still fighting. The ship had taken 5 hits by this point. We had lost our aft missile array in the 6th hour, which reduced our long-range offensive capacity significantly. Diane Hollies had managed our power distribution through each damage event with such efficiency that our combat effectiveness had not dropped below 70%, despite the accumulating damage. But there were people in our medical bay. Lieutenant Calloway read me the names at the beginning of the 7th hour, 7 people who were not going to finish this engagement standing at their stations. 7 names, not numbers, names. Captain Mwangi asked me to read them on the internal channel. I did. After the last name, she ordered a 10-second silence across the ship. Every station held it. Then she said, "Resume stations." And we did. I want to explain something about what we were doing out there, because I think it is easy to look at 8 warships refusing to yield in the face of 31 and assume it is about pride, about stubbornness for its own sake, about some human need to prove something to species who look down at us. It was not about that. It was about the 6 clauses in the Protectorate Agreement. It was about the principle that a signature on a treaty means something. That if you sign an agreement guaranteeing another species' rights and then vote to strip those rights away behind closed doors with political pressure applied to dissenters, you do not get to call that law. You do not get to tell the species you have just wronged that the proper response is compliance. We had not come to the Kareth corridor to fight the Conclave Armada. We had come to establish as clearly and permanently as possible that Earth's response to having its treaty rights stripped away was not going to be a formal complaint filed through diplomatic channels, that we were not going to argue the point at a council table we had no seat on, that the Conclave's model of humanity as a manageable dependent species with limited options was wrong, and that we were going to demonstrate how wrong it was at a time and place of our choosing. We had chosen this place, we had chosen this time, and we had prepared for it. For over a year, the Defiance held together. She was battered, running on rerouted power. 3 sections, missing system she had arrived with, but she was still flying and still on her assigned vector. So were the other 7. At hour 9, Admiral Sorvith called for ceasefire. He framed it as a gesture of goodwill. I paused to allow diplomatic channels to open. He used careful language that avoided any acknowledgement of what had actually happened in the past 9 hours. Captain Mwangi let him have the framing. She did not argue the wording. She understood, as I did, that the framing was irrelevant. What mattered was that he called. She said we would accept a ceasefire on the condition that the Conclave Council open formal negotiations on the status of the reclassification measure on an open channel with all member species present within 48 hours. There was a pause on Sorvath's end. A long pause. He agreed. Captain Mwangi closed the channel and sat back in her chair. She did not smile. She did not say anything. She looked at the tactical display where 31 Conclave vessels were holding position around 8 damaged human warships, and she was quiet for a moment in the particular way that people are quiet when they have carried something for a very long time and have just set it down. Then she said, "Calloway, what's our communication status?" "Full capacity on primary and backup channels, Captain." "Get me Earth Command, secure line." "Yes, Captain." She looked at me. "How's the ship?" she said. I checked my panel. "Flying," I said. "A little worse for the wear." "So are we," she said, and that was all. The next 48 hours moved quickly in political terms, which in galactic politics means they moved at a pace that would feel glacial to anyone used to human institutions, but that represented a genuine acceleration by conclave standards. The formal council session opened on schedule. All 15 member species were present. The open channel was established, which meant that the same 43 civilian systems that had watched the engagement were now watching the session that followed it. Captain Mwangi was not in the room. I was not in the room. We were on the Defiance supervising repairs and watching the session feed on the bridge display. Earth's diplomatic delegation handled the council session, led by Ambassador Claire Devlin, who had spent 11 years navigating conclave politics and who had the kind of patient, precise intelligence that council sessions required. Devlin did not demand, she did not accuse, she presented the 6 violated clauses, she presented the documented pressure applied to dissenting member species before the reclassification vote, she presented the communications record of the engagement and the conclave's destruction of civilian relay stations. She presented all of it without drama, in sequence, and then asked the council to explain how any of it was consistent with the charter that every species in this room had signed. The council could not on an open channel with 43 systems watching. The reclassification measure was suspended pending full review within the first 3 hours of the session. By the end of the day, 6 member species had co-sponsored a reform motion that would strip the conclave of the authority to restrict a member species' fleet rights without the consent of that species. The vote on the motion was scheduled for the next regular session. Ambassador Devlin, in a message to Captain Mwangi that was shared with the bridge crew, described the session as more productive than expected. I thought that was a very diplomatic way of saying that the conclave had no good options and had chosen the least costly one available. On the second day after the ceasefire, the Voroneth Free Press published its final piece in the week-long series they had run on the engagement and its aftermath. The headline translated from their language into the standard commercial dialect read as follows: "The humans were watching the whole time." The piece itself was long and detailed, and drew on information we had not publicly released, which told me that the Voroneth had sources we were not aware of, which was not surprising. What mattered was the argument the piece made. It said that humanity's action in the Kareth corridor was not a spontaneous act of defiance. It was a planned, prepared, patient response to a political maneuver that the conclave had been building for 3 years. It said that for 11 weeks, 8 human warships had sat invisible in contested space, learning the conclave's communication patterns, fleet movements, and tactical habits, not because they planned to use that information to start a conflict, but because they planned to use it to survive one that they knew was coming. It said that the lesson of the Karoth corridor was not that humanity was more powerful than the Conclave, it was that humanity had refused to be the thing the Conclave assumed it was. I read that article in the officers' mess on the second day after the ceasefire. I was eating something that was technically classified as a meal, watching the text scroll on a personal tablet, and when I reached that paragraph, I put the tablet down and looked at the wall for a moment. I thought about what it had taken to get here, not just the 11 weeks in the corridor, though that had been difficult. In its own quiet, grinding way, I thought about the year of planning before that, the months of intelligence work, the conversations in closed rooms on Earth, where Fleet Command had asked the question that no one in the Conclave believed humanity was asking, which was, what do we actually do if they move against us? Not what should we do, what will work? I thought about every person on the Defiance, Lieutenant Baines and his engineering team who had repaired damage at speeds that the Conclave's computers refused to classify as real. Calloway, who had managed communications through 9 hours of active engagement without losing his composure once. Diane Hollies, who had kept our power systems running through damage events that should have forced us to withdraw. The 7 names I had read on the internal channel, the 19 in medical who had gone back to their stations as soon as they were cleared. None of these people had done anything that makes a good story at a formal ceremony. They had done their jobs with discipline and precision for 9 hours in a situation where the easy choice would have been to stop. They had not stopped because they believed what they were doing was worth the cost of doing it. That belief is not unique to humans. Every species that has ever held a line under pressure has understood it. What may be unique to us is the particular way we arrive at that belief and the stubbornness with which we hold it once we do. We are not a species that accepts a conclusion simply because an authority tells us it is settled. We ask questions, we check the working, we push back on the answer if the answer does not match what we can observe with our own eyes. The Conclave had told humanity for 30 years that our role in the galaxy was defined, our position was fixed, and our options were limited. It had said this through policy and through the quiet daily assumptions embedded in every diplomatic interaction and every treaty negotiation and every glance from a Conclave officer that communicated without words that humanity was junior and was expected to behave accordingly. We had listened to that message for 30 years, and then quietly, without announcement, we had decided it was not accurate. Not with anger. Anger is loud and careless, and it gives your opponent information about your emotional state that they can use against you. With patience, with planning, with the kind of preparation that only becomes visible when it has already done what it was built to do. The relentless defiance left the Karath corridor under her own power, which was the only way she was ever going to leave it. She was escorted by the other 7 human ships, which was not something any of us had been certain would be possible. When the engagement began, all 8 ships had taken damage. None of them had been destroyed. None of them had withdrawn. I stood at the observation viewport on the port side of the bridge as we move through the corridor and watched the Karath stars slide past. The corridor had been a contested navigation zone for decades, fought over in treaty sessions and political meetings and quiet armed standoffs. It would continue to be contested. The events of the past 9 hours had not resolved the underlying territorial disagreements that made this sector important, but they had resolved something else. The conclave had a model of humanity. It was not a hostile model in most respects. It was more like the model a very large, very established institution maintains for a junior member that it has decided does not require close attention. The model said that humanity was capable, technically competent, occasionally difficult in diplomatic sessions, and ultimately dependent on the conclave's protection for its long-term security. The model said that if pressure was applied carefully and legally, humanity would accommodate itself to the new reality because the alternatives were too costly. That model was wrong. It had always been wrong, but it had persisted because no one had ever given the conclave a clear demonstration of how wrong it was in a context that could not be explained away, dismissed as a localized incident, or quietly suppressed before it reached the wider galaxy. We had given them that demonstration. 9 hours, 8 ships, 43 watching systems, 2 civilian journalists whose names would appear in every account of this engagement written for the next 100 years, 7 human crew members whose names I had read aloud on an internal channel, and who would be remembered in the right places by the right people for the right reasons, and a headline in the Vorcha Free Press that the conclave could not take back. The humans were watching the whole time. I folded my tablet, finished what remained of my meal, and carried my tray to the disposal unit. Somewhere in the conclave high command, a diplomat was writing a report, explaining to his superiors how this had happened, how 8 human ships that should not have been in this sector had appeared without warning, held a position against superior force for 9 hours, triggered political crisis that reshaped the internal dynamics of the conclave, and then departed having lost nothing except some hull plating and weapon systems that we would rebuild. I hope the report was thorough. I hope they were taking detailed notes. I hope they were asking the right questions about what it meant, how it had been prepared, and what it implied about the next time. Because we were going to keep watching. We had not stopped. We would not stop. That was simply what we did. While the conclave debated and voted and issued orders it expected to be followed, without question we were quiet and steady and patient and attentive, and we were learning everything worth knowing. The relentless defiance moved through the Karath corridor toward human space, running no cloak, making no effort to hide, flying in clear sight of every sensor in the sector. We did not need the cloak anymore. We had already said everything the cloak was covering.